My name is Ben North. If you're not familiar, my name is Ben Northcutt. I'm the senior pastor here at LifePoint. And what we are doing tonight, as odd as it may sound, is we are helping you to fulfill your destiny. Kind of sounds like we're in a late night infomercial. But Paul writes in Ephesians 2, he says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God predestined for us to do." What that verse means is it means that part of what God is doing, God's work, is us. We are God's handiwork. One of the things that God's doing is He is maturing us. He's bringing us to fullness and completeness. And so the work that He has predestined, that He has destined for us to do is this right here, that God is in the process of maturing your children. It's not you that has the responsibility for maturing and teaching and making sure that your children grow up to be productive members of society. That's God's work. However, as a part of that process, God also has work that He has already decided is that you are the right tool for those certain parts of that process. And so tonight I get the pleasure of helping to make you into a better tool for the work that God is using and going to use you to do to help mature your children. And so tonight we want to start off by lowering the anxiety level, and let's just go ahead and say that your children developing in their understanding and their familiarity with sex is not on your shoulders. You are a tool that God will use, among others, to do that, but it's not on you, it's on God. And so let's go ahead and get that, let's go ahead and chill out just a little bit there. Now, that being said, what is it that you are planning or hoping to get out of this? So, have you asked yourself that question? Is that something that you had already thought of before you came tonight, or before you clicked on the link online? Just go ahead and think a little bit. What is it that I'm hoping to get out of this? 9 times out of 10, when we ask ourselves that question on the front end, we are more likely to gain what it is that we are hoping to gain or expecting to gain. Also, tonight, we heavily recommend that you take notes. If you're with us in the room and you don't have a handout, we've got handouts that are over by the sound booth. Feel free to pick up one of those. If you're with us online, we actually have the same handout linked in the discussion box. So if you scroll down in your YouTube video, there's a discussion box or a description box in the bottom. There's a link to the same handout. You can pause the video. You can print that out. You can put it on your tablet and write notes on it. Whatever. If that's helpful to you, that is at your disposal. Lastly, if you have questions tonight, there's a couple of different ways that you can ask those questions. Now, if you're watching with us live, you actually can text me. If we can throw it up. It's okay. In just a second, they'll throw our contact information for me up on the screen. You actually can text me tonight. You can text me tonight, and if I get your text in the midst of while we're recording this, then we'd love to address your question live. You also can chat. You can type your question into the chat box in the YouTube feed, and when the time comes, we'll address those. Now, if you are watching this but you're not live, then feel free to email me. My email address is on the screen. Feel free to email me, and I can respond to your question, even if it's weeks and months or years from now. All that being said, we always want to start in the right place, and so let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we recognize that you are the one who is perfecting. You are the one who is leading and training our children. And so while we ask that you use this time tonight to make us better tools in your hands, we also first and foremost want to recognize that this is your work that you're engaging in. We just want you to use us. We love you, Lord, and we thank you ahead of time for the way that you are now and are going to be developing and continuing to mature our own children. We pray according to your identity and your character. Amen. Now, tonight we have a number of guiding principles. When we talk about how do I talk to my child about sex, there are sort of two different questions here. One of those is, what do I need to teach my child about sex? That's a great question. That's not what we're going to address tonight. That's not what tonight is about. Tonight is more about, as I'm doing that, how do I go about engaging in those conversations? How do I go about addressing their questions? Hey, buddy. We got one of our children in the congregation tonight, so it's super unprofessional of me. Sorry, but when a baby says something, it's just hard not to respond. So. That being said, the first thing that we would just want to start with tonight is when we talk about how to talk to our children about sex, there is no the talk. The way that we want to think about this is not so much about the talk. How do I give the talk? It's much, much more about an ongoing series of conversations. Now, when is your child ready to talk about sex? How about a particular conversation within the sex topic? When is my child ready to talk about, and then fill in the blank? What do you think? Never? Oh, ever. Yeah, no, the answer really is whenever they're able to ask the question. When your child is able to ask a question, they're ready to talk about it. Now, we always want to answer our children's question. Whatever the question is, if it's asked sincerely, if it's not asked as a joke, we always want to answer the question. It doesn't have to be a complete or full answer, but we need to answer the question. If my child asks, where do babies come from? They're ready to talk about, on some age-appropriate level, where do babies come from? If my child asks, how does daddy's seed get into mommy's belly? Then they're ready for an answer. They're ready for the answer. Every answer doesn't have to be complete and full. After answering the initial question, don't be afraid to defer. There's nothing necessarily wrong with saying, "Hey, we'll talk about that when you're a little older," but that doesn't always have to be the answer. The answer either. A lot of times, it's okay to say, "Let me think about it," or "Let me think about how to explain that," or something along those lines. But we always want to answer whatever question is asked. All kinds of reasons for that. We'll talk about some of those a little bit later. But if your child is old enough and ready to ask the question, then they're ready for some kind of answer. Now, in my own life, I have found that cars are great places to have these conversations. Cars are great places to have all kinds of conversations that are harder to have, because when you're riding in a car, there's not necessarily an expectation that you're going to look people in the eyes to have when you have the conversation. But also, as you're interacting with your child, don't be afraid to utilize everyday occurrences for investigating what your child knows and understands. So realistically, we live in a world in which even the most conservative of parents, your children go to school, they watch television shows, they interact online, or eventually they will. And there are going to be times that your child finds something out that didn't come from you. As you are interacting in the same world that they're interacting with, don't be afraid to ask questions. When you see a tampon advertisement on a billboard or online, don't be afraid to ask, hey, do you know what that is? Do you know what a tampon is? Do you know what a maxi pad is? Commercials about erectile dysfunction. Those are fun, right? Do you know what that is? Great Victoria's Secret commercials or underwear commercials are great opportunities to ask your children not just investigative questions, but evaluative questions. Questions like, do you think that this woman is using her body to glorify God? You can use those kinds of things both to gauge what does my child know and also how well is my child navigating what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. Now, a common thought is, well, do I really want to direct my child's focus to this? You kind of have to use your own discernment in this. So if you're pretty confident that something is going over your child's head, a particular joke in a sitcom or a commercial where two men are sitting side by side very flirtatiously. If you feel like it's going over your child's head, then you may not want to draw their focus there. But there are times, and if you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. There are times when you just know that it is not going over their head. And so they're picking up on it anyways, going ahead and illuminating it and helping your child to recognize what's going on and recognize where that fits in to God's plan and other things is not a bad thing. It's coaching, it's parenting, it's a lot of what parenting is. And the more that you talk to your kids, the more that they will ask questions. So the more that you respond when they do ask a question, the more they feel like it's something that they can ask questions about, which is what you want ultimately. If they're going to ask questions, you want them to be asking them to you. Second guiding principle is call things what they are. Now, sometimes when we've done this training before, we just asked people, what are all the names? What are all the names that you grew up calling things or your parents called things? Anyone willing to offer that? Wiener, wee-wee, TT. Yeah, all kinds of words that we throw in, either sometimes just because it's easy for a kid to say, also sometimes because we're a little ourselves uncomfortable with things like the word penis or vagina. In this ongoing series of conversations, what is best for your child is to use correct medical terminology. Now, why is this most helpful? Because when your child asks, what is that dangly thing in the back of my mouth? And you tell them that's your uvula. There's no, she said uvula. No, it's just what it's called. The skin on the loose skin on the end of your elbow is your weenus. So kind of a funny word, but that's what it is. It is your weenus. The dangly thing between your legs is your penis. That's what it is. And particularly in their younger ages, if you call things what they are, then what you are teaching your child is this is just basic anatomy. There's nothing taboo. There's nothing particularly funny or silly about certain parts of the body. They're just parts of the body. And one of the big things one of the big, huge guiding principles in this idea of a lifetime of conversations is we want to avoid making subjects taboo. When we make a subject taboo, what we are saying is this is shameful. This entire, not this little piece or this behavior, but this entire subject is shameful, and we just don't talk about that. Well, that's not really helpful for anybody, and so we want to avoid making things taboo. One of the ways that we do that is we just call things what you are. Those are your testicles. That's your labia. That's your clitoris. They're just organs. They're parts of the body, just like everything else. If you want to think about it in a particular way, anatomy comes before physiology. So in every other realm of biology, we learn what something is before we learn what it does, or we learn how sex works before we attach hormones and emotions to it. In your development of your children, you very much want to teach them how sex works, or how the biology of sex works, before they're attaching that to things like romantic intimacy. Research shows, for instance, that kids that grow up on farms are much less likely to be sexually deviant than kids who don't. Why would that be? Because from the earliest age, they're watching animals mate with animals. Just like they're watching animals eat and animals do everything else that animals do, animals mate. That's one of the things that animals do. So yes, overall, this idea of we're teaching our children anatomy, call things what they are, prevent things from being made taboo. Now, the third thing we want to talk about, and sort of the next logical step of this, is we also want to be age appropriate. So while at the same time that we want to answer all of a child's questions, at the same time that we want to call things what they are, we also want to be age appropriate. And we know our children, we know the level that our children are operating at, and we want to explain things in a way that our child will understand. And so things like one of my 4-year-olds asked me at one point how, not where do babies come from, but a little bit more specifically, how does the baby get into mommy's tummy? Okay, well, first of all, I could have said, well, I could have described how the penis goes into the vagina and how semen comes out of the husband's penis and crawls up the fallopian tubes, and I could have gone through all of that, but my kid's 4. And so my answer was, well, the daddy plants a seed in mommy's tummy and it grows into a baby. Now, if my child had asked, well, how does the seed get in there? Then I could have answered, well, it gets into mommy's tummy through her vagina. But that question wasn't asked. For my 4-year-old, daddy plants a seed in mommy's tummy and it grows into a baby, was more than enough. It didn't come till a year later that the next question came, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Don't be afraid to under-respond and then gauge whether or not that's enough of a response. You don't need to overshare. Also, make sure that you're answering the question being asked. And again, remember, we're not thinking in terms of when is my child ready for the talk. We've tossed that out the window. There is no the talk. The question is, what is my child's question today? So for instance, the question, where do babies come from, does not require, well, when two people love each other very much. Think about it. Where do babies come from? That's a how question. When two people love each other very much, that's a why question. They're not asking a why question, they're asking a how question. So, for instance, we can absolutely answer, we can even answer the how question fully anatomically accurate. We can say a seed comes out of the daddy's penis, goes into the mommy's vagina, and plants itself in the mommy's womb, and that grows into a baby. That is, hey, okay, I just answered the how question. We don't have to talk about sex. We don't have to talk about how mommy and daddy are attracted to each other. That wasn't the question. Now, maybe that is a follow-up question. Maybe it isn't. I don't need, Rome wasn't built in a day. You don't need to open the whole box just when your child is scratching on the outside of the surface. Answer the question that's asked, and then gauge, is this a sufficient answer? Okay? By the way, as you are coming up with questions, don't hesitate to text those in or put those into the chat box. And those of you who are watching the chat box, as we finish up a section, if a question's come in, let me know and we can go ahead and answer. Do we have one? Okay, so we're good at the moment. The fourth thing that we want to remember as we're having these conversations is where appropriate, be cooperative in finding information. Now, none of us know everything that there is to know. None of us. And even if any of us did know everything there was to know today, by next week, there would be whole new categories of weird sex stuff to know. Let's just be honest. There's a lot of weird sex stuff out there. And then aside from all the weird sex stuff, there's tons of not weird sex stuff that we just don't know. In any other realm of questions that our children ask, in none of those do we feel the need to know everything. It's perfectly fine not to know everything. But when you realize your children are asking you a question that you don't know, first of all, it's perfectly fine to answer, I'm not sure about that. But the next phrase needs to be, let's discover that together. Let's find that out together. And then just as with any other realm of knowledge, get together and pursue that answer in the way that you would with anything else. Now, be careful what you Google, but you know that. Particularly when you're Googling images or videos or whatever. Obviously, be careful with that. But investigate that together. Just because you don't know the answer, first of all, doesn't make it a bad question. But also just because the resource of a particular information site doesn't have all the answers that you want your child to have also doesn't make it a bad source or non-useful source. One of the things that you're trying to do in parenting is you're trying to teach your children to evaluate sources of information. So it's perfectly fine to Google a question and show your child, seek out the answers together, and then when you find an answer, evaluate it along with your child. Now, in this instance, this absolutely applies for the 4-year-old just like it does the 14-year-old. We're probably talking a little bit more toward the 14-year-old here, but that same idea can be applied across the board. You want to establish yourself as the expert when it comes to sex. Now, one of the things to understand, regardless of whether you have a 9-year-old or a 9-month-old, statistically speaking, you are the expert for the entire world for your child. For in every area, you are the expert. So if you think that you're not, you probably are. Very, very, very rarely, in very, very rare situations, is anyone other than the parent, the person that the child just assumes knows all the answers. Now, we have a lot of foster families in our LifePoint family, and so we also understand that in a foster family situation, it is a little bit different. And sometimes there's some tension between the foster parent as a source of expertise or the biological parent as a source of expertise. However, generally speaking, understand you are the expert, at least up to age 12. Now, statistically speaking, up to age 12, you are the expert. After that, things start to change a little bit. But even after that, you want your child to come to you for the information. You want to establish yourself as the expert. Be willing to give out any information that's asked for. In this topic, again, there are no bad questions if asked sincerely. Now, you've got to discern, is my child really asking this question, or is this a joke? Is my child being crude? Obviously, if your child's being crude, call them for being crude. But sort of getting back to that whole realm of weird questions, when your child has a weird question, you want them coming to you, not to Google. And there are so many weird things. You want them to feel like, even for the weird stuff, they can come to you, and if you don't have the answer, then you'll figure it out together. Again, if your child is ready to ask the question, they're ready for the answer on some level. Okay? Also, don't be afraid to admit that you don't know something. We do want to be as familiar with the topics that our children are engaged in as we can, but nobody can be an expert on everything. There is one in your, if you have a copy of the handout, there's one source that we recommend. It's called the Digital Kids Initiative. Now, this is not sex specific. It is sort of student trends specific. And so this website, a lot of times as parents, not only do we not know the answer to our kids' questions, we don't even know kind of what the current trend for where to find that is. The Digital Kids Initiative is put out by the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. It's a great website. They sort of stay on top of trends in particularly student or teenage culture today. And so there are lots of good resources out there. That is that's one in particular that we recommend. Fifth, I think we're on our fifth one. How do we know how to respond to all of the variant variations or ways of deviant sexual behavior and sexual other things? The answer is we want to couch everything in God's design. Now, here's what we mean by that. We want to start with how God designed things to work and then compare everything to that. The stereotypical example that's used so often is the FBI. When the FBI teaches their agents how to discern real currency from fake currency, they don't spend their time looking at fake currency and seeing all the different ways that currency can be fake. They spend their time looking at real currency. And they get so familiar with what real currency looks like and feels like and smells like that it becomes easier to distinguish something that isn't real. We want to do the same thing with sex. We want to start with how God designed things to work and then compare everything to that. So husbands and wives have sex to produce children, and because it's enjoyable and because it makes them feel close. And there are other reasons as well. But that is, from 10,000 feet, that is God's design for sex. Everything outside of that is not within God's design for sex, and as such is less than God's best. Now I'm going to say that again. We want to memorize those two words and use them over and over and over. God's best. In other words, everything that isn't inside God's design isn't God's best. Using that terminology helps us. It helps us in dealing with. It's a better phrase than is it sin or is it not sin? Is it right or is it wrong? Well, there are things that maybe aren't wrong that still aren't God's best. There are things that maybe the Bible doesn't specifically call sin, that if we look at what God's best is, we would have to say it isn't God's best. using that kind of language and that kind of concept with our kids, it helps our kids think not so much in, is it right or wrong, as much as what is it that I'm trying to pursue? I want God's best for me. Anything outside of God's design is not God's best. So, we want to let God's best define the variations, not the variations define God's best. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, for instance, we don't define what a horse is by saying, well, it's not a cow and it's not a chicken and it's not a duck. Well, that kind of leaves everything that isn't a cow and a chicken, a duck. Well, is that a horse? No. No, we define what a horse is, and then we know that cows and chickens and ducks aren't horses because they're not horses. We want to focus on what God's best is and let everything that isn't that distinguish itself in our kids' minds by the reality that it isn't what we know God's best to be. When we're talking about God's best, we don't need to qualify our explanations with all of the variations of the way that sex can be distorted. In other words, we don't need to say, God made sex for a husband and wife within marriage for these purposes, and not for this and this and this and this and this and then this, and just list all of the ways that can be broken. That's not helpful. Most of the time, they're not asking that anyways. We also, and this is sort of a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it's important to say, speak about those who practice the variations in ways that assume the best intentions and motivations of those people. In other words, just because a person, let's say, is in a homosexual relationship, if you're watching the video and you don't realize that Life Point Church doesn't teach homosexuality, our understanding is that homosexuality is outside of God's best, and so we roll with that. However, as an example, we don't want to teach our children that people who are in a homosexual relationship are bad people. We don't want to teach them that they are trying to rebel against God. We don't want to teach them that they are gross. We don't want to teach them that they are deviant. We don't want to assume the worst of their motivations. We want to assume the best of their motivations. I will say for my children, we explain to our children that people who are in homosexual relationships are confused, and we use the word confused because they don't understand what God's best for them is. And so we use the term confused, and we'll be watching a show and a commercial will come up and two women will be kissing on the commercial, and they'll say, are they confused? They're confused. Now, it's not they're bad. It's not they're terrible, they're gross. It's they don't realize what God's best is. And helping our children to, again, associate the idea of there's God's best and then there's everything else helps them learn to associate well the difference between the people and what they're doing. So a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it needs to be said, and that's the the most logical place to say that. Now, who at this point feels like having a conversation with their child about, and then fill in the blank, about the hardest thing would be really difficult? My guess is most of us, that's why we're here anyways. One of the things that we want to do is we want to try to work through our discomfort ahead of time. Now, no one here is saying you shouldn't be uncomfortable by talking about any of this. Considering the variety of ways that we were raised and the ways that various ways that our parents dealt with these topics, it's amazing that we're not more uncomfortable than we are. Even the fact that we're here a part of this shows a degree of desire to work through some of this discomfort. However, just so that it's said, if you are uncomfortable talking about sex, if your child comes to you and they're asking a question and the reality is that you're not comfortable or you are very uncomfortable, your child's going to pick up on this. Your child knows you. They know when you're happy. They know when you're sad. They know when when you think something is funny, and they know when you're uncomfortable. And so, if particularly over time, if every time they come to you, they sense Daddy is uncomfortable talking about this, then number one, they're going to be less likely to come to you. Number two, they're going to be more likely to assume that this topic is taboo. And third, they're going to be more likely to associate shamefulness with their curiosity. They're curious, and so they're coming to you, and they're sensing that there's something wrong with this. And so they're more likely to associate their curiosity with shame. And so just sort of to help you understand the significance of you working through some of your discomfort, it really does make an impression on your child. And it's very, very hard to hide that. So, obviously the answer is, well, I would love to work through my discomfort, but how do I do that? How do I change the fact that this is an uncomfortable situation? Well, or a comfortable topic. The first is find someone that you trust and talk through some of this with them. Talk through some of your discomfort, talk through some of these questions, some of these topics. Odds are the person you're talking to has some discomfort about this, and so you can work through it together. If you're married, it's a great thing to do with your spouse. If you aren't married, or for whatever reason you feel like that's not the right person, find a trusted friend, find a family member, and just be real honest. Hey, look, I know that this is going to come up at some point. I want to be ready for it when it does. Can we practice talking through some of this together? Second, where appropriate, be honest with your child about your personal discomfort. There's nothing wrong with asking this. There's nothing wrong with this question. It's a totally normal kind of thing. However, I'm not feeling like I'm ready to talk about this. There are times, particularly those of you who have children that are a little bit older, your children may ask you questions about your past experiences with various things that you're not ready to talk about. And it's okay to tell your child, to be honest, I'm not ready. I'm not really ready to talk about this. Can we talk about it later? Now, the important thing is to come back later and talk about it. When you are more ready. Having that level of honesty with your child is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Also, those of you who are married, where possible and also where appropriate, be affectionate with your spouse in front of your child. Now, the important thing is, where appropriate. Obviously, there are inappropriate levels of PDA with your children. However, it is good for your children to see mommy and daddy showing affection to each other. It also helps them see that the category of sex, affection, romance, intimacy, that is not something just that happens in the bedroom. That is a normal part of married life. Almost finished up here. I've forgotten which number we're on, 6, 7, somewhere in there. It's important to remember that how you as a parent deal with your child's errors and mistakes guides how they view themselves, the world, God, and also sex. Now, let me bring attention to the word guides. How you respond to your child's errors and mistakes guides. It does not determine. In other words, if you err in responding to your child's mistake, you're not necessarily messing up your child, but you do have influence. And when they mess up, particularly when they realize they have messed up, the difference between you coming down or being gracious, between you coming alongside them and helping them make a better choice next time versus responding to them as gross and disgusting and untouchable, that's a huge, huge influence in the way that they come to see themselves, see sex, see God, the world, etc. One of the things that you can do is you can distinguish in your own mind the difference between sexual curiosity and sexual deviancy. Now, just asking a question or showing an interest in a particular thing, that can be construed as sexual curiosity. Your child is curious. They're going to be curious about lots of things. Just because they're showing curiosity doesn't mean that they are being deviant. If you are, this is there's kind of a fine line here, and so if you have sort of a more specific question about that, I encourage you to reach out to me. If I don't have the answer, I can point you in the right place. But just understand that those two are not the same thing. Also, again, we've already talked about this, but no question, there is no question that's a bad question in that of itself. Also, if you're kind of coming to this late in the game, if you've got a teenager, if you've got a tweenie, you know that your child has been introduced to sex, and you know that it was not by you, and so you're feeling late in the game. You're feeling like, well, I don't want to be the awkward parent who says, hey, let's have the birds and the bees talk, and then the child says, oh, no. Wherever you are, just start talking. Just start making use of those natural places that topics come up in watching television shows and seeing advertisements and hearing innuendos. Begin to talk wherever you are in the process. Begin to talk. I promise you, your child will thank you for it in the long run. Also remember that as a parent, part of your job is to be a coach for your children. Now think about this. Any of you that have played any sports, that have undergone anything where you had a coach, your coach doesn't have one conversation with you and then have you go play an entire season. No. The coach, you have practice, and then you go have a game, and then you come back and you talk about the things that you did well and the things that you did that you can grow on, and the coach gives advice, and then you go play some more, and then we do some more coaching. That's, excuse me, that's part of what we're doing as parents. As things happen and your kids experience new things, talk about them. When you're a teenager or 20 or whatever goes on their first date, talk about it when you finish up. When they have their first boyfriend, when they have their first kiss. Again, if you have established yourself as the expert, if you've developed a pattern of these are okay things to talk about, there's a likelihood that your child is going to come to you and ask these sorts of questions. And even if they don't, there's nothing wrong with bringing up these things. You're establishing yourself as a coach. You want to talk about things as they happen. You want to point your kids in the right direction. And they're going to make mistakes. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to make missteps. Just like a coach, your role is to step in and help them make course corrections. It's not to lay out everything that they should do and then wait until they mess up and then bring the hammer down. That's bad coaching. Also, it can be really helpful to be honest with your child about your own missteps. In a lot of ways, particularly with older children, that can buy you a lot of credibility. When you say, you know what, I made this decision. In retrospect, I wish I had made this decision. My son is 10, and even now, I have already started talking to my son about my marriage with his mother, and certain tensions and things that are difficult, that I find difficult in loving his mother well, or taking good care of his mother, and helping him to understand part of what it means to be a good man and be a good husband. But being honest about your own errors or mistakes can help in your child's mind. Help in your child's mind realize that when they make errors and mistakes, that's the norm. It's not the exception. Now, obviously, be age appropriate. There are certain errors and mistakes that I'm not going to talk to about with my 10-year-old child or my 10-year-old son. Maybe when my son is 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 25, 30, by the way, those of you who feel like maybe this doesn't apply to you much because your kids are grown, your child never stops dealing with sex. Therefore, your role in coaching them never stops. So maybe we should have said that at the very beginning, but we're saying it now. As you are sharing your missteps and mistakes, be really careful not to glorify sin. Don't make it sound like, you'll never guess what I did this one time. No, that's not the right way to think about this. This was an error. This was not a funny story. Make sure that you clarify, that you make it very clear that a misstep is a misstep. Also, understand that honesty and transparency are not the same things. You can be honest and not say everything, not tell all the stories, not tell all the details, and so on and so forth. And then, in my personal opinion, one of the most difficult pieces of this whole thing is, particularly with your older children, from 11, 12, and up, when you see your child making a misstep, when you see your child doing something wrong, you are the best coach for them when you remove the parental emotion. Now, this is really hard because what's going to happen is you're going to see your child making a mistake, and you're going to flip, whether it be flipping out of frustration with them or flipping out of concern for them. But you got to remember, your teenager is so overwhelmed with emotions that you need to be able to appeal to something other than emotion in their mind. Appeal to reason, appeal to relationship, appeal to something other than emotion, because they are overwhelmed with emotions, and many of those are new and strange and unfamiliar emotions. And so dealing with your parental emotions on top of all that is just not the best way. It's just not the best way. So when you see that, before you immediately jump in, take a second, take a breath, try and pull the emotion out of it, and then step in with something more than just that emotional blow up. Last, but certainly not least, be content with less than perfection. Now, some of you are going, what? Obviously, I want perfect. Obviously, what I want for my child is to not make any mistakes in anything, but certainly not when it comes to sex. Obviously, we all want that for our child. None of us want our children to make mistakes, and certainly not in the area of sex. But your children are going to make mistakes. Anyone who already is you know this. You know your children are going to mess up over and over and over and over and over. Realistically, the absolute best that we can hope for is that when our children mess up in the area of sex, number one, they know that God has already forgiven them. And number two, they are able to continue to pursue Him without shame. In the area of sex, the number one most problematic thing about about sexual mistakes when it comes to our walk with Jesus is that our culture, and particularly Christian culture, but even just not Christian culture, has associated so much shame with sexual deviancy that when when any of us, adults, children, whatever, realize what has happened, we immediately assume that everyone, including God, is now going to look at us differently. Many of us do, but God doesn't. So the absolute best thing that we can teach our children about sex is that sex, from God's perspective, is no different than accidentally saying a dirty word or hitting your sister. That when I misstep, that there's no shame there. There's no shame there. There are consequences, but there's not shame. Now, we absolutely need to be content with less than perfection from our children, but maybe even more importantly, we need to be content with less than perfection from ourselves. Now, the best advice I've ever gotten from any professors or scholars on parenting is that so much of our stress and tension as parents comes from the fear that we're going to mess up our children. Now, you're going to mess up your children. Sorry, you are. You're going to mess up your children. Just like your parents messed you up. No, probably different than your parents messed you up, because 9 times out of 10 what's going to happen is you're going to be trying so hard not to mess your kids up in the way that your parents messed you up that you're going to mess them up some other way. So let's just go ahead and toss this idea that maybe if I do everything exactly right, I won't mess up my kids. Nope, you're going to mess up your kids because you're messed up. Here's the good news. Either God is powerful enough to eventually straighten out our children from whatever ways we mess them up, just like He's straightening us out from the ways that our parents messed us up, or God doesn't have that much power. And if God doesn't have that much power, then we've got a whole lot of problems, a whole lot bigger than talking to our kids about sex. So, hopefully everything that we've talked about has helped to give you, first of all, to decrease some anxiety, to give you some thoughts about having these conversations, to debunk some myths that are propagated by society and culture. But at the end of all of this, we've just got to trust God with our children and be thankful with what He has told us, that He's going in the ways that He's going to bring our children to completion and maturity and fruitfulness. That's it. Now, questions. Again, if you have a question, feel free to text it to me. Feel free to type it in the chat box. We do have 3 questions that have come in this week in preparation for this. Right now, do we have any in the chat box, Hillary? Oh, okay, we're good. So we're good in the chat box. If any come in text message, we'll do it that way. First question, what should you do when you catch your kids playing doctor? In other words, showing their private parts to each other. Okay. So we're going to stifle a laugh, for starters. All kinds of personal stories come to mind that I'm not going to share tonight. But the biggest thing here is it goes back to, we want to make sure that we're not, however we respond, that we're not communicating that our private parts are bad. Now, the very first time you see your child your son pulling his pants down and showing his penis to his friend, your reaction is going to, whoa, put your pants up. It's okay. You haven't messed up your child by hollering at them to pull their pants up. But in the follow-up conversation that comes from that, and by the way, 100 times out of 100, when you correct your child, it's much more about the follow-up conversation than it is the way that you initially respond. You're going to initially respond in the ways that you naturally respond most of the time. But number one, have the follow-up conversation. And number two, before you have the follow-up conversation, take a second to think about what you can do in that follow-up conversation to communicate what you want to communicate. So the biggest thing that we want to communicate here that we don't want to communicate is that our private parts are bad. Now, I'm not 100% sure the context of this question when it came in. If we're talking about what I would call a pre-romance child, in other words, we're talking about a little boy showing his penis to his friends, or a little girl showing her vagina or pulling her, or whatever. If that's what we're talking about, then very appropriate to have a conversation and just say, there are certain parts of the body that we just keep to ourselves. There are certain things that we just keep to ourselves. There are certain parts of the body that we just keep to ourselves. Not make a huge deal out of it. We just don't do that. If it's what I would call a post-romance situation, in other words, if the question is, your kids are old enough that they know what's going on here, and they're playing doctor as a way to get a little, cool hand Luke-ish. I just realized that may not make sense. They're flirting by playing doctor and touching inappropriately. Depending upon whether or not your child is the boy or the girl, in either situation, I would consider couching this conversation within the context of who am I in Jesus? In other words, if God is who God is, and because of who God is and what God has done, that creates who I am in Jesus, then what does that mean? Who am I in Jesus? Well, one of the things that I am is I am a gift to my future husband and wife. That part of this sex conversation, tying in a little bit closer to the part of the romance situation, is I am a gift to my future husband and wife. Now, they are also a gift to me, but I am a gift to them. And a lot of what sex is and romance is and the physicality of dating and that it just gets really hairy really fast. But again, talking about God's design, God's design, that a big chunk of who I am is I am God's gift to whoever my spouse is going to be. And the giving myself to someone other than who that is I would recommend using the phraseology, it is a misuse of the gift. Stay away from, it's like, now I'm going to give my spouse a used gift. No, that's bad. That's not what we want to communicate. Just leave it as I am a gift, and I don't know that God is going to give me to this person. That's a misuse of that gift. Yeah, that's probably the route that I would take, given the limited amount of time that I've had to think about that. I believe a question. Yeah, how should I respond? Well, how should I respond when I catch my child touching themselves? Okay, all right. So certainly a situation no parent wants to deal with or walk into. Again, I think probably if what we're talking about is a pre-romance situation, we're talking about a child. Very common for even very young children to, in the bathtub or whatnot, to realize if I touch a particular part of my body, that feels really good. Well, if we, sort of take away the private part of that and say, I realize that when I do this, it feels good. I realize that, when I, sit and rub my arm, it feels good. There's nothing inherently bad about realizing there are things ways that I can touch my own body that feel good. When a particularly young child is doing this, again, I would say be very careful not to communicate that's taboo, that what they're doing is shameful or taboo. The biggest reason is you can't take away a boy's penis. You know, I mean, there's literally, you can't ground a child from having close proximity to their own private parts. And so if you turn something into taboo, what's gonna happen is just exactly what happens with all of it. Anytime there's something taboo, it makes us want that more because we're sinful and whatnot. And if you communicate to your child touching yourself in that way, yeah, it feels good, but it's taboo. Well, all you've done is you've just assured that they're gonna do that 30 times more than they were anyways. I will say we have taught our children at certain times there are, with all kinds of things, there are the right place and context to do that, and the wrong place and context to do that. And everything from passing gas to asking questions about certain kinds of things. Well, there's a right context and a wrong context. And so tying that into that same conversation might be the way to go. As your child gets older, if you know that your child has gotten to a point where they're associating touching themselves in a certain way with, basically we're talking about masturbating. When we talk about masturbation, if that is if whoever asked this question, if that's the context, email me. We can talk about that a little bit more. If you have that question with regard to your child, email me. We can talk about that more. Overall, I would still recommend letting that come into the God's best conversation. In other words, God's best for sex is husband and wife engaging in this together. Everything outside of that is less than God's best. In other words, try to get away from using terms right or wrong and begin to use the terminology of, is it God's best or is it less than God's best? And if it's less than God's best, why would we want that? The only other question that came in this week, at what age should my child stop being nude? At what age should my child stop being nude in front of brothers and sisters? In other words, I'm assuming this is at home, whether it be they're changing it into their pajamas and they're just changing, they're not going to the bathroom or going to their bedroom, they're just changing, or whether it be, getting out of the bathtub and running around the house naked or whatever. I forget, I'm in the North. Naked, not naked. That's how we would say it in Mississippi. Naked, running around the house naked. I'm tempted to say that it's time to stop doing that when it becomes a problem. Most of the time, your child is going to know, they're going to associate a certain degree of shamefulness with that. At a certain age, they're going to want to change in the bathroom or in their own bedroom. They're going to want to wear, if it's a girl, they're going to want to wear a bra. They're going to want to, they're going to want to do those things. Maybe to some degree when your child becomes aware of their own body, particularly they're aware of their own private parts as private parts, different than just you've told them they're private parts. When they begin to get self-conscious about their own body, or maybe when it becomes a source of self-consciousness or shame for anyone in the family. In other words, you may have a 3 or 4-year-old that is, it has no real consciousness of the fact that they're wearing underwear or not wearing underwear, but you might have a 10 or 11-year-old in the home that goes, oh, and sees that there's being something deviant about that. Well, that's for you as a parent to work through and determine, but there's also, there is also some characteristicness of if one child's nakedness is causing problems for another child, well, it's not that big a deal to go off in a bathroom and change clothes. Biggest, I would, yes, unless they are finished and use the family sauna. Yes, absolutely. Good joke, guys. My biggest recommendation: let this be a topic of conversation as you're having these conversations. Let this be a topic of conversation that morphs and melds as your child gets older and is having these sorts of conversations. I think that's all we've got in terms of questions. We are so glad that you joined us tonight. Whether for those of you in the room or for those online, we want to be a LifePoint family that is that's walking through these kinds of things together, and so we're glad that you joined us. Just one more time, if you have a question that either you didn't want to share or you think of later, or it's just a little too personal, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to whether get together or respond in writing or whatever you need. Let's finish our time in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this evening and the time that we've got to spend together. We thank you for sex and the wonders of this wonderful thing that you have created, and all the wonderful ways that we get to both enjoy it and create family with sex. Help us to help our children come to understand and to enjoy it, also in the ways that you have determined are your best. We love you. In your precious and holy name we pray. Amen.